Hey, the show's starting.
Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Laughing Place Movie Club. I am Mac, the Marvel content editor here at Laughing Place. I have some friends with me, same X-Men group we've got for the last two movies, here to talk about the very first X-Men movie tonight. Personally, for me, this is the first time I've watched this movie in I don't know how long, and I actually enjoyed it more than I remembered. What about you guys? What did you think?
I think it's
Becca?
I think Becca. It was good. I can see kind of why superhero movies seem to keep going after this, but it felt darker than I remembered it as far as like the cinematic quality of things, but still an enjoyable movie.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to bring up that this is really the first mainstream Marvel movie, right? Pretty much. Before that, you had mostly Batman and Superman were the big budget superhero movies that were coming out. So this kind of broke the mold and remade the mold.
Come on, what's the first Marvel movie that came out?
Howard the Duck, right?
There we go.
Oh, yeah. All right.
This did seem to be the one that really kicked off that superhero craze, though. I mean, after this, you had Spider-Man, and then, obviously down the road, launch of the MCU. But Jeremiah, what were your thoughts on rewatching X-Men?
I don't remember the last time I actually watched it. I mean, I think we've made fun of the Toad line every live stream that we've had, but other than that, it was kind of yeah. It was kind of like, okay, I went back and rewatched it, and the two things that came out was it's a beautiful film, other than it's really dark as far as cinematic goes, like Becca said. Come on! And they do a great job with the casting.
Yeah. We've mentioned that with the previous movies, but I wanted to point it out again. I mean, seeing that first scene where you see Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, talking to each other, it really just felt like I'm just watching Charles Xavier and Magneto. That's just who these actors are at this point. And then, I mean, that's the first time you see them, and it already just clicked. It was so perfect. The movie opens up with that, at this point, very familiar scene, which feels like we see it in every movie where Magneto discovers his powers.
That's the Bruce Wayne's parents getting killed of X-Men.
Yeah.
They just keep going back to that well.
Yeah, well, it was nice that at least is consistent, because that's the one thing this franchise lacks. Well, it's one of the few things the franchise lacks, but consistency. At least they stuck to that scene as sort of a big point. The one of the antagonists in some way is Senator Robert Kelly in this one. I pointed out when we did Days of Future Past a while back that he was actually supposed to be the subject in that story. So I found it interesting that they used him here in the first movie instead. On top of Stewart and McKellen as Xavier and Magneto, we also got to see Hugh Jackman, make his big debut as Wolverine. What are your thoughts on his first big performance? More importantly, what are your thoughts on the Wolverine hair?
What is FDL?
Future Disney legend.
Good job, Becca.
What was the guy's name who was originally Wolverine? Dougray Scott?
Oh, was he really?
Got me.
Yeah. I think he was making like a Mission Impossible movie, and they had to recast him because his production ran over on that one, and they brought in Hugh Jackman. So legends are made by accident.
He had a mustache they couldn't CGI at that point. Is that what the Mission Impossible thing was?
Something like
they
that.
had to get somebody else. Oh, nice.
Yeah, actually, Hugh Jackman was the first guest on Marvel Storyboards, and it was a very interesting episode. He talked about how going into this movie, he knew nothing about Wolverines. He didn't think Wolverines were a real thing. So he was doing research on wolves to learn how to Wolverine. So it was very interesting. Definitely recommend checking out storyboards on the Marvel YouTube channel. So we talked about how Magneto, Xavier, and Wolverine were pretty great. Very well casted, well done characters for this franchise. There were some others that weren't so great. Did any of you have anybody that stood out in particular?
Are you talking about Ray Park?
I mean, that's one. He's on the list.
I never thought Halle Berry was that great as Storm.
Yeah, I would agree. I think to me that's the biggest miss this franchise has had, like in terms of casting. That was just not the right role for her at all.
Well,
go ahead.
If you think about it, in 2000, out of all of those names, Halle Berry was really the biggest name that was in this film.
Oh, and they gave her like 4 or 5 lines in the whole movie, right? Like she barely talks.
But the best line
to Toad when they're struck by lightning. The same thing happens to everything else.
Yep, there it is. There's our reference for this week.
Excellent job.
One character that I remembered absolutely hating from this movie was Sabretooth. And watching it this time around, I actually didn't mind him as much. Still wasn't great, but he definitely talked a lot more than I remembered seeing. I remembered it just being a whole lot of growling.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was kind of surprised with that character and how much more I actually enjoyed him. One of the big things that this kind of loosely based around was the idea of mutant registration, which I thought was interesting too. When Robert Kelly said that line, kind of just really popped up and like, oh wow, this is really ahead of the Civil War, Captain America's Civil War story, so many years ahead of it. Very interesting that popped up in there.
Was the Mutant Registration Act part of the comics, though? I feel like that would have been taken from the X-Men comics early on, right?
Yeah. That whole idea, yeah, that was. I mean, that's pretty much the basis of all of the X-Men comics forever. Humans and mutants fighting essentially. But I just thought it was interesting that's we talked about how this kicked off the whole superhero movie craze, and here we are. That same storyline comes back, almost 20 years later.
Right.
Let's see what else they did. One inconsistent note I had from just within a few scenes of this movie, actually, where Robert Kelly actually mentioned a girl in Illinois who can run through the walls. Obviously, a reference to Kitty Pryde, right? A few scenes later, we see Professor Xavier talking to a student that he calls Katie, and then she runs out through the walls. Obviously not in Illinois, already in.
But you think the implication I thought was that he had like recruited her based on that rumor or that news story. He went and got her. I don't know. I didn't have a problem with that.
Okay, that makes sense. Then if that's the case, it still wasn't Ellen Page, so that's unfortunate.
Yeah, right.
Did she show up in, I can't remember, in X2, or is it just in Days of Future, or not, I'm sorry, Last Stand that we get Kitty Pryde?
I believe it was Last Stand. I would have to go back. It's been a long time since I watched X2 as well, but I believe
that'll be next week.
Why isn't that coming to Disney Plus? Do we know?
I'm not sure.
I'm sure it'll get there sooner or later.
Yeah.
This movie wasn't at all, it didn't have anything to do with Marvel Studios, right? Other than it's just Marvel characters. Because we didn't even, or did they just not even have an opening sequence?
There was
Spider-Man
no Marvel at this point. Like this was the first of everything.
Rights.
Okay. And did I miss a Stan Lee cameo? Because I didn't see one.
Yes, you did. It's in there on the beach. He's the hot dog vendor.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, when Kelly's coming out of the ocean in his messed up new
Okay.
mutant form. You see,
One of the things watching this movie again and thinking back to when I saw it in 2000, I would like to go back to 2000 and see the response of the people who weren't the comic book fans, because really this one is dependent on you knowing these characters. I mean, X-Men has never done a good job of explaining their backup characters, but Storm just kind of pops out of nowhere and you're like, oh, that's her power. And other than the handful of comic book nerds back in 2000, it wasn't like oh, everybody knows everything about the X-Men. Even the cartoon wasn't as popular among the mainstream.
Yeah, I think that's the big accomplishment of this movie, is that it turned the X-Men into household names, where before, like you said, but besides the comic book, the TV show and the stand-up video game, the arcade game. Remember that 4-player arcade game?
Yes,
I don't think a lot of people knew who the X-Men were, like outside of those circles.
Yeah, and this was very unique. I mean, to kick off a franchise without doing an origin story. I mean, how many times after that did we get Spider-Man's origin story? We got Batman's origin story. Though I guess at that point, really, most of the Batman movies and like the other superhero movies that were really succeeding weren't really origin stories. I guess I would have to, I mean, going back to those original Superman movies, I don't really remember too much about that. Jeremiah, I would have to.
Oh yeah, well that first one is definitely an origin story.
Yeah, both Superman and Batman retold in some way during their movies, like, okay, Crime Alley and Krypton exploding. But that's very basic. It's one character. That's all you need to know. Plus, Batman and Superman had TV shows that have been widely popular for decades. But this was X-Men, 2000 was the time when X-Men started to blow up with the Jim Lee taking over the comics and Marvel and all of that. But, again, I'm sure if we all went back to that time, we would kind of walk out of there going, who was that guy with the yellow skin?
Right. Yeah. And this movie really is, very much just, you jump in and here's Magneto and here's Professor X and then here's Rogue and then here's Wolverine and they just keep throwing more characters at you. And yet it doesn't feel overwhelming, really. Like I mean, granted, this is coming from somebody who was familiar with the characters already, but to me, I don't know, it didn't feel like it was too much where it very easily could have been.
I noted that I felt like the pacing was slow and deliberate, not boring, but like we're going to take our time with each of these characters. But then at the same time, I also felt like we weren't getting a ton of information. You were just spending time with everybody. But I think I'm probably spoiled a little bit from the MCU, like going back to this and having these worlds where you get to kind of play with each, storyline in each movie. But I do think that, I also feel like the movie was almost like a living comic book. Just especially with the lighting, there were a couple of scenes where I'm like, we're looking at comic book panels. I don't know. And if it's your first introduction to these characters, even that still, it worked.
Yeah, I think that's the other important thing to note, is that the previous blockbuster superhero movie to X-Men was Batman and Robin, right? Like that was the last one before this. And
so the bar was low.
Yeah, so this is swinging the pendulum in the other direction, where they're trying to ground it a lot more, and I think very successfully. I do think this movie suffers in its third act, like that. The climax at the Statue of Liberty, once they get to Statue of Liberty, it kind of falls apart for me, because I still think they were having trouble figuring out how to properly choreograph like fights between these characters, and it didn't feel like large scale enough to me. It's all very. So you could tell it's all like shot on sound stages and stuff. So I think a lot of the X-Men have that problem. A lot of the X-Men movies have that problem in the climax, but otherwise I think it's pretty successful. And like most franchises, it really finds its footing in the second movie. Most franchises like this, like they're kind of figuring out how this all would work. And then once they got that formula right, the second movie really picked up and ran with it.
So on the fight scenes, you mean you didn't like Ray Park hitting the Darth Maul pose after he knocked Storm into an elevator?
Yeah, was that intentional? I guess it must have been.
Yeah.
Right. It was too perfect not to be.
And then you've seen that deleted scene where like Spider-Man runs out of the elevator or whatever, right?
If I have, it was a long time ago, and I'm not.
Okay.
It was a joke. Like, it wasn't supposed to be that, but it's one of the times where everybody's like doing something, and then all of a sudden a guy in a Spider-Man costume just appears. And I think it's Wolverine at that point, and he just kind of pauses and looks like, what just happened?
Well, knowing what I know now about Hugh Jackman getting into this movie, he probably had no idea who Spider-Man was at that point. So it was probably very confusing for him.
No. Okay, here's a rant for me for 2 seconds. You think about it, Hugh Jackman was nowhere near a star. If not for X-Men, like, he'd been on some Broadway stuff. He's from Australia. Nobody knew him. And then all of a sudden he shows up. And if you think about it now, like, Hugh Jackman, Wolverine, Greatest Showman, the 2009 Academy Award opening where he is Wolverine.
The Prestige.
The Prestige.
The Prestige, but that's also one of those very niche, like, it's like, I love The Prestige, but yeah, everything else.
Come on, it's Batman versus Wolverine as dueling, 19th century magicians. It's awesome.
That's so
DC
true.
versus DC.
With Alfred and Black Widow in there too.
Gosh, wow.
Yeah. But yeah,
That's
I mean, Hugh Jackman really, out of everybody in this franchise, he's come out of this smelling the best because he's set for life.
Right. On the flip side of that, I do want to, are we done? We're officially done with the Jeremiah rant? On the flip side of that, I did want to bring up Rogue and why do you think they decided to go with Rogue as the focus? Because they drastically changed the character. And I mean, really, like, pinpointed her as essentially the main character of this movie. Why do you think they went with that in that direction?
First of all, is Anna Paquin's accent terrible, or is it just me? Okay.
The accent, she has a very Dick Van Dyke accent where it starts off very Southern, and by the end it's like, oh, she doesn't have any accent at all.
Right. I was going to say, I thought I remembered her, like, in later movies not having any accent whatsoever, and then by the end of this first movie, it was already gone.
Yeah.
I think to answer your question, I think they wanted a accessible, relatable teenage character to be the protagonist. It's an audience entry point. It's somebody who doesn't know about the X-Men at the beginning and learns about them later on. Although that shifts because once they get to the school, to Xavier's school, you kind of follow Wolverine for a little while and he becomes the protagonist. So they kind of go back and forth between those two as being the protagonist.
Yeah, to Mike's point, I was like 13 or 14 when this came out, so I really thought Rogue was cool. So yeah, probably for that girl audience who maybe wouldn't go to a comic book movie otherwise. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that it's twofold because Anna Paquin was a name when this came out. She wasn't Halle Berry, but she was still a name. And
that's right. She had won the Oscar, hadn't she, for the piano? Am I wrong about that?
I know that she had some stuff going on before this.
Yeah, I think she might be an Oscar winner at a very early age, but maybe I'm misremembering that.
But then there's also the cartoon and the comic book. At that time, the two hottest characters were Rogue and Gambit. So, and that's why they kind of started to try to bring Gambit in later films, and that never worked out.
Right. Yeah, no, it's funny that you brought that up because that's what made me think of, I agree. Like, Rogue was one of the biggest characters, and I just thought it was interesting that they so drastically changed the character from what was such a popular character from the animated series. When they had other characters to use, like like Jubilee, for example, who, by the way, appears in the background of one of the classes.
Yeah, so Jubilee is a teenager in the mid 80s, and then she's also a teenager in the late 90s.
Yep.
For whatever reason.
But you know what? They went back and changed the timeline, so
Sure.
It's, whatever. So another scene I wanted to bring up was the fight both on the train and at the train station. They made it a point, especially in these first 3 X-Men movies. They had a lot of scenes where Wolverine and Magneto would fight. That to me, it angered me seeing it more than once, because why does it keep happening? It's a guy made of metal and a guy that can control metal.
But it is okay. It is really cool that time though, because you're introduced to Logan, Wolverine, and you're like, oh, this guy's like the ultimate BA, like he's gonna kick everybody's butt. And then like you get to that train sequence and Magneto's just like, nah, you pose no threat to me whatsoever. So I thought that's really cool, a really good moment. And then I think, I mean, this has nothing to do with Wolverine, but the moment where Magneto steps out onto the front steps of the train station, I think that's my favorite scene in the entire film, when they're surrounded by all the cops and he like lifts up the 2 cars and comes crashing down on the other ones. And then he has that conversation with Xavier, like via Sabretooth and Toad.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I thought that was probably the coolest scene in the movie.
When they first get to the train station, it reminded me of what they did with Loki in Avengers, which is, all these years later.
Absolutely.
Just comparison, but you were going to say something.
No, yes, sorry. I did think it was funny, the end of that scene, Mystique swooping down in a helicopter to pick up Magneto, when he very easily could have just, kind of levitated him and his team away. It's something very funny about a guy that can control metal escaping in a big metal vehicle.
The other thing is the cop that has like the bullet spinning on his forehead. Why doesn't he just go like?
I was wondering that too. Like when everything's stopped, that's your moment to like duck down or to like fall to the side.
And instead, he just lets out a very awkward scream that will stick with me forever. They also used, and it's kind of weird going from what we've watched previously to getting into this one now, with this being the first movie that came out. But they also used the whole Xavier getting attacked through Cerebro plot point, which if this happened after Apocalypse, why is he still going in to use Cerebro with nobody else in there for assistance? Just seems like a bad idea.
There's a lot with Cerebro, especially in this one, that bothered me. It's like, hey, this green stuff just disappears when we disconnect it. And then this line where he's talking to Logan about Cerebro, and he goes, he's trying to locate him. And he's like, he has a helmet he has some way of blocking me that's a helmet. Like, okay, this helmet has been since, first class. So even without the timeline messed up, there's something wrong.
And I had complained about Mystique being able to copy Peter Dinklage's thumbprint or whatever in that other movie. And then in this one, she copies Xavier's eye retinal scan. So I guess she can just go down to the molecular level on those when she's taking their form.
When they're fighting at the Statue of Liberty and she sends out the blades, it's like, how does that happen? And wouldn't it just like fall apart?
Well, then she screams and Kyle was like, wait, she can like copy all of this stuff and make herself exactly like the other person, but then her voice is like, ah! It's like, I think that's just for us to know who's who, but yeah, like.
Yeah, she also has this amazing control over her power throughout the entire movie, but then as you see her on TV, as she's walking away, her eyes flash yellow for a good several seconds to let everybody know it's Mystique.
So is that something that she has control over, or is that just an involuntary?
I'm not sure exactly what happened in that one.
She had a hiccup right then, just like, oh, my eyes.
What about her as the mini Statue of Liberty too?
That doesn't make any sense at all.
It's like, okay.
Change the shape of her head to match the Yep. One gag they threw in there that was simultaneously, fantastic for fans of the comics and the animated series, but also a huge eye roll moment when Wolverine questions the costumes and Cyclops asks him, "What would you prefer, yellow spandex?" Which I was going to wear my yellow spandex for tonight's episode, but it's in the wash right now. So I had to bring that one up.
I remember that getting a big laugh in a theater.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it is kind of a take you out of it, fourth wall breaking moment for sure.
Yeah, it's the poke at the fans.
Right.
One of the things, like this movie, watching it, I realized that this was definitely early on in computers, and hey, we're going to do everything we possibly can to show how cool we are. Because really, if Magneto's trying to do all of this, does he have time to make his little balls bounce back and forth without a string or anything? Like, that's his whole... He wastes time doing that.
There was one part in particular, actually, in that the big fight scene in the Statue of Liberty, where Wolverine gets thrown and kind of like uses his claws to catch part of the statue's crown and like spin around. I just looked at that and I was like, it actually, to this point, the CGI didn't seem that bad, but that moment for me was just that. I mean, it looked like it might as well have been the animated series.
I've always hated that shot, and I'm pretty sure that shot is in one of the trailers, and it just made the movie seem really cheesy before I saw it. And thankfully, it's mostly not like that, but yeah, that still stands out.
So Mike mentioned his thoughts on the big third act fight scene in the Statue of Liberty. What did you guys think, Becca?
Yeah, it feels so different from everything that we've seen since, yeah, you just have almost all these like little fights going on, and
Jeremiah.
Up to the part the Mystique Wolverine fight, we've seen in every cartoon ever done of the, hey, you can steal somebody's look, but it's still entertaining. But yeah, there's the whole part of Magneto, like, I'm going to raise up my machine now and put it in the torch, and it just like drags. And I'm not saying that because it's 20 years later. It dragged originally too.
I think another compliment to pay this movie is that I said this right after it was over yesterday, is that the best parts of the movie are when it's people standing around talking. And that's really impressive when it comes to like a superhero movie,
Yeah,
like the action is not the best thing about it. Like, that's pretty cool and pretty revolutionary for the time, I think.
And I think that goes back to how good the casting was. I mean, really every scene between Xavier and Magneto was fantastic. You really got to see Wolverine develop as a character, which was really cool. Another one that a lot of people I think hated, but I honestly loved, James Marsden's Cyclops. People hate the character, but that's the point. He's supposed to be that hated character. He's just, completely unlikable. And I think Marsden nailed that. So really, only good things to say for most of the cast of this movie. I did think I had to point out again too, because they did it in Apocalypse. So now again, they had to explain the hair color for Rogue, give a whole backstory, because that's the consequence of this whole movie, right? Is a streak in Rogue's hair. That's pretty much.
Yeah, all of that. She gets stabbed with Wolverine's claws early on, and then through her powers she's able to heal, and then the big thing is her hair changes.
Yeah, because I mean, Magneto goes into some sort of plastic prison, but he's going to get out of it. So really, all that happens is Rogue got a little.
Yeah, I mean, guys, that is kind of a drastic thing to have to change your hair. Like, it's pretty drastic.
Oh, we were waiting for it, Becca.
I wish I had it, but.
All right. Anything else you guys wanted to add about this movie?
You guys could talk. Go ahead, Jeremiah. Go ahead.
This was definitely hey, we are starting a franchise film, and this is I think this is one of the early, like, this is a tentpole film. We are going to make it as much as we can. And I don't really remember a lot of movies prior to this being hey, we're starting something huge and you're going to waste your money for 20 years on this franchise.
Yeah,
but it's still good.
Sorry, did anybody else watch this fully expecting a post-credit scene, even though we knew there wasn't one?
Yeah.
Sorry, Becca, what were you going to say?
No, just I was thinking back to the I had written a note about the CGI and just that Senator Kelly part where he turns into that blob of water. Like, it was really well done. I didn't care for him crawling through the grate so much, but that was really impressive, I thought. And then also I really liked their little mutating map as they were coming up with their plan. I thought that was pretty entertaining even now. Like, watching that was sorry, veering us off in a different direction.
Mike, any other thoughts?
Yeah, how many, if you count like Deadpool and the Wolverine movies, how many movies have come out of this movie? How many sequels and spin-offs are there? They're like 10, right?
Yeah, right around there.
So, yeah, you gotta respect that, I guess. It really launched. I mean, and that's not counting all the other superhero movies that like found inspiration or confidence in coming into being because X-Men was a success. So it was the beginning of an era for sure. That's the least you could say about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've knocked these movies quite a bit as we've been doing these. But yeah, I agree 100%. This really, it not only kicked off its own huge franchise, but really started that craze. I mean,
so 12 movies.
But yeah, really kicked off the superhero movie craze. But so yeah, it was really cool going back and watching this because, like I said, it's been quite a while since I've seen the first one.
It made me want to watch X2 like right afterward, but I'm like saving it for when it comes to Disney Plus eventually when we do this. Because that's my favorite one.
Yeah, I would agree with that. If you're not counting the Deadpool movies, of course.
Yeah.
I'm not a Deadpool fan.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, that's gonna do it for us. Thank you guys for joining me to talk about Dark Phoenix. Yeah, I would take Dark Phoenix over Last Stand, to be honest.
Yeah, anything over Last Stand.
I'll need to go back and watch Last Stand again, apparently.
So yeah, our next Laughing Place Movie Club will be the Peanuts movie, and that will be on Thursday. What is that? The 13th? Do I have my dates mixed up? Is that right?
I think
You're right.
13th is right.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me to talk about X-Men, and thanks everyone for watching.
Bye.
Bye.